In today's episode of Unsolved Mysteries, we're going to be exploring the heinous crimes of a serial pedophile rapist in Melbourne, Australia, known as Mr. Cruel. He has never been identified, and his 3 confirmed attacks and suspected murder currently remain as unsolved cold cases. In the late 80s, there was a reward of $200,000 for finding the 2 little girls who had been abducted by him, but that reward has now been increased to $1,200,000 to whoever provides information of Mr. Cruel's whereabouts that could lead to his arrest and conviction. Who exactly is this criminal who has committed these unspeakable acts? What is his motive? Where is he currently hiding? Also, is he still active? These are questions that still need answers, but let's dive deep into the clues to come up with our own theories and speculations. Let's get into this case now. On August 22, 1987, in Lower Plenty, Australia, a man broke into a family home at 4 a.m. armed with a knife and a gun. He first targeted the parents by tying their hands and feet and locked them in a wardrobe. The perpetrator then tied the son to the bed and proceeded to rape the 11-year-old daughter, for which her name to be confidential. After assaulting the daughter, he then cut the family telephone lines so that they were unable to call the authorities, but luckily, the perpetrator left the crime scene without murdering any of the family members. Then on December 27, 1988, approximately 1 year after the first incident, Mr. Cruel struck again in Ringwood, where he broke into the back door of a house at 5:30 a.m., armed with a knife and a small handgun. Like the previous instance, he first bound and gagged the parents, but this time, he demanded money. From the Wills testimony, the perpetrator first went into the bedroom of John and Julie Wills and put a gun to the temple of a sleeping Mr. Wills. He forced the couple to lie face down on their bed and tied them with a copper wire and took $35 in cash. He then grabbed their 10-year-old daughter, Sharon Wills, in which he proceeded to put tape over her eyes and place a small ball gag in her mouth and abducted her. At around 1:30 a.m. on December 28, Sharon Wills was found by a woman near Bayswater High School in the suburb of Bayswater. Dressed in garbage bags, the 10-year-old told the woman her name and what happened to her, saying, "A man left me here and told me to go and ring home." Sharon Wills had been repeatedly molested at an unknown location before being dumped at a high school. When later questioned about her horrific ordeal, Sharon Wills told the officers that she had been shackled to a bed. She had been blindfolded throughout the horrific ordeal, so she was unable to see. However, Sharon Wills did say that she could constantly hear aircraft noises. This led investigators to believe that Mr. Cruel had used a location near an airport. Unfortunately, the lead wouldn't be enough to find the man that has now been dubbed as the Hampton Rapist. Then on July 3, 1990, after approximately another year from the Sharon Wills incident, Mr. Cruel would attack again. This time, he had targeted a home in the suburb of Canterbury. The premises on the Monmouth Avenue was home to the Linus family. The Linus family, who were from England, consisted of Brian and Rosemary and their 2 daughters, Fiona, who is age 15, and Nicola, age 13. At around 11:30 p.m., he entered through the home through a window. Unlike with the previous attacks, this time the parents were out and the 2 teenage girls were home alone. Mr. Cruel woke both of the girls, and he angrily ordered Nicola to fetch her school uniform. Mr. Cruel then bound, blindfolded, and gagged the 15-year-old Fiona to her bed. Mr. Cruel told Fiona that he wanted $25,000 for the safe release of her sister before abducting Nicola Linus. The abductor took the rental car of the family that were using and made the getaway. The car would be later found a kilometer away, which it was assumed that Mr. Cruel had transferred Nicola Linus to another vehicle, but was never found. However, on July 6, Nicola Linus was dumped near Kew, near an electric power station. It was the day of Nicola Linus' 14th birthday. She had been held captive and repeatedly sexually abused for over 50 hours before her release. Nicola Linus was able to provide the police with several details in which they hoped to lead to a suspect. She described the attacker as being around 5 foot 8 inches and having reddish brown hair. Although blindfolded throughout her ordeal, Nicola Linus had also managed to sneak a peek of the room she was held captive in and gave a description of it as well as the bathroom. Nicola Linus told investigators that the attacker had several times spoken to another person. She had never heard a response. Did Mr. Cruel have an accomplice, or was this just another of his little games? Nobody knows. Nicola Linus later remembered another detail. After the Linus family had returned to England, she reported a detail similar to the previous victim, Sharon Wills. During her captivity, Nicola remembered hearing a low-flying aircraft. This gave police the belief that the attacker lived within the vicinity of Tullamarine Airport. Police now had far more information to go on, but again, they had little in the way of forensics. Nicola, like Sharon Wills before her, had been thoroughly washed and cleaned by Mr. Cruel. He also left very little evidence at the Linus home during the abduction. So because Mr. Cruel was able to carefully eliminate all of his backtracks, he was never identified. On April 13, 1991, Mr. Cruel would strike in what would be his last known crime. At 9:15 p.m., wearing a same ski mask, he would enter a home and Templestowe through the window. This time, it was the home of the Chan family. The home belonged to John and Phyllis Chan, who shared the home with their 3 young daughters. Inside the house, he encountered Carmine Chen, who is age 13, and her 2 younger siblings. Mr. Cruel bundled the 2 younger girls into the nearby closet, blocking their escape by placing a bed in front of the closet door. He told the children he only wanted Carmine to help him find the money in the house. He then proceeded to abduct Carmine Chen. Before completing the abduction, however, the attacker would leave behind several messages. He spray-painted the words and phrases, "pay back," "Asian drug deal," and "more to come" on the Toyota Camry that belonged to Phyllis Chan before fleeing with Carmine. Investigators eventually ruled out the messages as yet another red herring. In their opinion, the perpetrator had used them to send the police looking in the wrong direction. Instead, police looked into similar cases, soon seeing the similarities with the crimes of Mr. Cruel. Despite fearing the horrific ordeal their daughter would suffer, there was at least hope from Carmine Chan's parents that their daughter would be returned alive. This had been the case previously, so detectives were also optimistic. However, several days after the abduction of Carmine Chan, her mother Phyllis would give heartbreaking plea for her release at a press conference. Letters written by her younger siblings pleading for her return were also printed in newspapers. Sadly, it wasn't to be. On April 9, 1992, just a few days short of their 1-year anniversary from her abduction, Carmine Chan's decomposed remains were discovered along Edgar Creeks in Thomastown. The killer shot Carmine 3 times in the head. She had been killed not long after her abduction. One theory as to why Mr. Cruel suddenly turned to murder was that Carmine Chan had discovered the identity of her abductor and paid the price. Carmine's own mom, Phyllis, was sure that her daughter would have put up a fight. Of course, that may not be the case. It may well have been the plan all along, as with each passing case, Mr. Cruel's attacks had become more extreme. Maybe murder was just the next step. The truth is, we may never know why Mr. Cruel killed Carmine Chan. The police force seemed convinced that the 4 crimes were all the work of one man. The method of entry, the mask disguise, the weapons used, all pointed to the same attacker. Investigators searched over 30,000 homes, with special focus on homes near aircraft routes. No useful leads to who Mr. Cruel was would be forthcoming. Over 27,000 suspects were also interviewed with similar results. A special task force named Operation Spectrum looked into the idea that Mr. Cruel would be a collector of child pornography. Despite over 70 convictions being made due to the work of the task force, none could be definitely linked to the crimes of Mr. Cruel. In 1994, Operation Spectrum was ended and the investigation into the crimes of Mr. Cruel went dead. On April 24, 1991, an FBI profile was sent to the Victoria Police Department. The key points in the profile were: Number 1, the attacker may reside close to the vicinity of the first assault. Number 2, he is involved with the school due to the attacks being in school holidays and asking for school uniform of his 3rd victim. Number 3, he would appear as a nice guy and seem genuinely interested in helping children. Number 4, the attacker would be dedicated to his role with children, perhaps even earning plaudits such as Coach or Teacher of the Year awards. Number 5, he will have a collection of both homemade and commercial pornography. Number 6, Mr. Cruel would be a functional member of his community. He will be employed, seen as a good neighbor, and may be involved in community projects. Number 7, the attacker will live in a single-family residence. Number 8, he may be in a relationship. If so, his partner would know of his sexual dysfunctions on his part. This may include role-playing, for example, her dressing as a schoolgirl. Number 9. Work colleagues would notice a change in his behavior after attacks took place. Number 10. In the mind of Mr. Cruel, he has no intention of harming the children. His attacks are motivated by sexual desire and his unique psychological profile. "15 years after the abduction of Carmine Chen, police revealed perhaps the most disturbing knowledge that they had. One of the survivors had reported that a camera tripod was present in the room where she was held captive. It was the firm belief of investigators working on the case that Mr. Cruel had filmed or photographed his victims for mementos. Police kept this information secret for so long as they believed if it became public knowledge, Mr. Cruel would get rid of what could have been vital evidence. In 2010, Task Force Apollo was launched. This was a new investigation into the attacks that had started over 20 years earlier. The team were hopeful that the improvements of technology and new investigation methods since the original investigation will lead them to finally solving Mr. Cruel's crimes. Problems arose pretty quickly. Task Force Apollo was shocked at the state of the files belonging to the case. The files were a complete mess. They were totally unorganized and had been misfiled. Worse though, however, was the fact that several pieces of evidence were missing altogether. This included the tape which had been used on one of the victims. Task Force Apollo had hoped this would lead to a possible DNA evidence, but now the vital piece of evidence was no longer in place. The knowledge that Mr. Cruel has seemingly had about leaving forensic evidence, Mr. Cruel's ability to stake out his victims and misled the investigation, and now vital evidence had conveniently vanished. Could Mr. Cruel have been a member of the law enforcement team? That is also a question that nobody knows. But now let's take a look at some of the suspects that could potentially be Mr. Cruel. The first suspect, the first 6 suspects were gathered from a list called the Sierra Files. In 2016, the Herald Sun newspaper was given access to a dossier into the crimes. The dossier, given the name the Sierra Files, was created in 1994 with the help of the FBI. The file gave information on 7 suspects that believed could be Mr. Cruel. 5 of the suspects were aged 57 and above, with one of them being deceased, while 4 others having changed locations or simply have told the reporters to go away. But as for the 6th suspect from the Sierra Files, Suspect 6 was a ghost. No response could be obtained from the Glen Iris home that Suspect 6 had lived during the attacks. No neighbors had any knowledge of him, nor did he have any social media accounts, nor was he in any phone book or on the electoral roll. So in the end, the majority of the suspects gathered from the Sierra Files were all a dead end. However, we're going to be observing the 7th suspect who is actually our prime suspect for this case, named Brian Elkner. Brian Elkner was a former lecturer at Melbourne University. In 1973, he was a senior lecturer in French and had several published essays. In one of his essays, called The Diderot and Sublime, the Artist as a Hero, he compared transgressive artists to criminals, declaring that they shared similar greatness. The essay was generally gushed over by the literati. However, little did they know that the man they were gushing over was also in the middle of a 25-month crime spree. During the period between 1972 to 1974, Brian Allen Elkner attacked 6 women and young girls. Like Mr. Cruel's attacks, the attacks took place in the victims' homes and they were threatened with a knife. In October of 1974, Brian Elkner was convicted and sentenced to 10 years imprisonment. He had pleaded guilty to rape and several other offenses. He was released shortly before the first known Mr. Cruel attack. Brian Elkner, now in his late 70s, admitted to knowing he was on the prime suspect when confronted by a reporter for A Current Affair, a news program on Australia's Channel 9. Elkner strongly denied any suggestions that he was Mr. Cruel, stating it was in his past and he had turned his life around. The interview does not show Elkner making the following ridiculous statement. After being told by the reporter he had destroyed the lives of female victims, Elkner said, quote, "So you say, but I mean what you're doing now is equally disgusting," end quote. Although a prime suspect in the case, according to the man himself, no charges have been made against Brian Elkner in relation to Mr. Cruel's attacks. Police believe Mr. Kroll may be responsible for a dozen more attacks on young children. Officially, however, his last known crime was the murder of Carmine Chen. So what happened to the Hampton rapist? Did Mr. Kroll get put away for another crime? Was he perhaps stopped due to his health? Did he suddenly, although highly unlikely, just stop? Or most worryingly of all, is he still out there committing these horrific offenses elsewhere? These are questions that still need answers, hence why this case is unsolved. Hey guys and gals, this is Mr. Shin Ramen, and I just want to thank you for making it this far. Did you enjoy the video? If so, it would be greatly appreciated if you can leave a like on this video and subscribe to this channel for more future content. Till next time, stay safe and stay scared.